Engaging students in peer review is popular practice as a learning activity and a source of information in L2 writing classes. Research has indicated that peer feedback contributes positively to L2 learners' writing processes and products, with peer-to-peer collaboration constituting a form of mutual scaffolding. The practice also helps to develop critical thinking skills and learner autonomy by enabling L2 learners to take an active role in their ongoing development toward optimal learning outcomes. Because it requires active co-construction of knowledge, peer review is regarded as an explicitly social communication process through which learners enter into dialogue related to performance and standards. Given that L2 learners are likely to be less familiar with conventional writing than their teachers, peer review can offer them the alternative advantages of fostering a sense of audience and ownership of their own work through a bilateral interaction with peers. Although the practice is not without criticism, such as the variable accuracy of feedback due to L2 learners' limited knowledge and experience and interpersonal difficulties, empirical studies have found a generally positive effect of peer review, with the learning gains inherent in giving and receiving feedback considered an acceptable trade-off. The last 3 decades have witnessed growth in research that focuses on emergent bilingual strategic use of linguistic repertoires or translanguaging in L2 writing. And this study shows that translanguaging is a naturally occurring phenomenon that functions as a self-regulatory mechanism that expedites the process of L2 learning. Indeed, the benefit of allowing L2 learners to move back and forth along their entire linguistic repertoire is now widely acknowledged by L2 teachers and researchers in diverse academic contexts. Despite consistent interest in peer review in L2 writing context, the issue of learners' language choices in the process remains severely under-researched. Given that the fully developed linguistic repertoire is an invaluable research that helps L2 learners outcome the differences in language, discourse, and idea inventory, pursuing the line of research examining when and why L2 learners use a certain language and to what extent L1 and L2 serve cognitive and social functions is necessary to provide sufficient empirical evidence for L2 teachers to make conscious, context-appropriate classroom language policy. This study examined L2 learners, L2 student writers' use of L1, L2, and both L1 and L2 in written peer feedback and the factors determining such language choices in the context of Japanese higher education. The study was conducted in an authentic classroom setting and sought answers to the following research questions. Number 1. When given a choice between L1 and L2, to what extent do Japanese L2 learners choose language to mediate their written peer feedback? Number 2, what types of written feedback are given in L1 and L2 respectively? And number 3, what factors influence Japanese L2 learners' language choice when providing written peer feedback? For this study, 24 Japanese students participated. They were English studies majors in their third year, taking the English academic writing course. The class met once a week for 100 minutes over a 14-week semester. The ratio of male to female students were approximately 1 to 1.5. The student essay chosen for analysis were one of the 3 major writing assignments for the course. They were 5-paragraph opinion essay ranging between 400 and 450 words on the topic of the pros and cons of smartphone use. The students reviewed peers' work on the day the first draft of the assignments were due in class. Before the start of the peer review, the teacher gave a detailed instruction on how to provide peer feedback on what English medium instruction was official policy in the school, and the students were encouraged to use L2 during the process. However, they were given a choice to switch out of it when necessary. When the in-class peer review task was complete, 2 peer-reviewed drafts were collected from each participant. So 48 peer-reviewed drafts were collected altogether. To explore the translanguaging practices implemented in the peer review activity, written feedback on the 48 peer-reviewed drafts were analyzed. They were first divided into corrective feedback and feedback commentary, such as comments with explanations, suggestions, or questions. The feedback points falling into each part were coded into 3 broad focus categories of form, content, and organization. In addition to the 3 broad focus categories, another 3 categories were incorporated into the coding framework, and they were formatting, such as indentation and incorrect line change, administration, which concerns meeting the requirements of the task, and overall impression statements that do not fall into the above-mentioned categories, such as encouragement and the reviewer's self-reflection. The coded feedback points were then categorized further according to language use, and those given in L1, those given in L2, those given in both L1 and L2, and proofreading symbols were counted separately. In addition to analyzing feedback profiles according to language use, stimulated recall interviews were conducted to determine the factors underlying the L2 learners' language findings. As outlined in Table 1, the feedback analysis yielded 678 feedback points, of which 76% were corrective feedback and 24% were corrective feedback commentaries. Of the total feedback points, 70% were delivered in L1, 52% in L2, 5% in both L1 and L2, and 20% in symbols. Among the 516 corrective feedback points, L2 was used most frequently, followed by symbols, and their combined use constituted approximately 91% of all corrective feedback analyzed. For feedback commentaries, L1 use accounted for slightly over 50%, and the remaining half were given in either L2 or both L1 and L2. Table 2 shows the relationship between language use and the focus of corrective feedback, comprising direct correction and error indications. Of the 516 corrective feedback points, 83% concerned form, 4% content, 3% organization, 10% formatting, and 1% administration. Of the total form-related corrective feedback, 39% concerned grammar, 22% expression, and 12% mechanics. While L1 was used to give corrective feedback across all categories, form-focused feedback was predominantly given in L2. This result is not surprising, given that such feedback was often given in the form of direct corrections. Translanguaging was implemented when the reviewers gave corrective feedback in the form of a suggestion or a suggestive question. Table outlines the relationship between language use and the focus of the feedback commentaries. Of the 162 feedback commentaries, 21% concerned form, 31% content, 21% organization, 2% formatting, 4% administration, and 20% overall impression. Of the total form-focused feedback commentaries, grammar and expression-related commentaries were addressed in 10% and 11% of total commentaries, respectively. On the whole, the feedback analysis analysis revealed that Japanese L2 learners opted for either L2 or symbols when providing corrective feedback, the combined use of which constituted 91% of all corrected feedback points. For feedback commentaries, L1 use constituted a majority. Translanguaging was adopted only sparingly by the Japanese L2 learners, accounting for a scant 5% of all peer feedback points. The analysis of the stimulated recall interviews identified primary themes that elucidate factors underlying Japanese learners' language choices when providing written peer feedback. While approximately 14% of the interviewees said that they consistently use L1 or L2, the vast majority noted that they make flexible language choices for the translanguage based on context. For example, although translanguaging occurred only occasionally, comprising only 5% of all written feedback data analyzed, 8 of 9 students who translanguaged in their written feedback cited a similar reason. They almost unanimously related that they temporarily switched out of L1 to reference concepts or expressions that they learned in L2 in the writing classes. An equally common reason for switching temporarily out of L1 was to reference part of the text that needs revision, which is inevitable when discussing L2 text. Most specifically, translanguaging occurred when students provided suggestions or corrections. A novel observation was made regarding why Japanese L2 students switched to L2 at an intrasentential level, and it had to do with their L1 orthography. 4 participants cited that they switched to L2 in place of complicated kanji. The L2 proficiency level of the writer was found to be the major factor affecting the peer reviewers' language choices. Almost 80% of the interviewees replied that they opted for L1 out of consideration for the weaker peer writers who might lack the metalinguistic vocabulary to understand their feedback. Another benefit to using L1 was identified in 2 participants' interview accounts. These students noted that interaction with low proficiency peers required elaboration on the aspects of L2 writing that they commented on, and that they benefited from giving feedback to weaker writers. It was shown that the students used their shared L1 not only as a tool for communication and to increase their participation, but also as a means to co-construct their L2 by making the task manageable. To facilitate communication with low-achieving peers, L1 use is shown to be indispensable for peer reviewers to provide scaffolded help. Thereby, peers discuss what needs to be done to solve specific problems. In addition to peer writers' L2 levels, peer reviewers' L2 proficiency was also found to exert an equally important influence on language choice. Half of the interviewees reported that their limited knowledge of L2 grammar terms, in particular, left them with no other option but to seek recourse to L1. While the interviewees explained their reason for using L1, one word was repeatedly mentioned, "aimai," which means vague or ambiguous in English. What the participants meant by the expression is that they used L1 as a mitigation or hedging tool. This points to the affective aspect of L1 use, which is essential in collaborative interaction in an L2 classroom. Over half of the interviewees recounted that by using L1, they could practically sidestep uncomfortable comments and bring a positive cooperative tone to the activity. Some of the students reported that they willingly took trouble to determine how to express what they wanted to express in L2 when paired with those whose L2 skills are strong enough to interpret their L2 comments. However, the analysis of the interview counts indicated that approximately 30% of the interviewees opted for L1 in fear of making mistakes when reviewing strong peers' essays. Providing erroneous comment would impose meiwaku, which can be roughly translated as being an inconvenience to others. In addition, students' beliefs and goals were found to influence their language use in peer feedback activities. Approximately one-third of the interviewees reported that they tried to use L2 as much as possible because they wanted to practice L2 as much as possible. Conclusions. The present study examined whether, how, and why Japanese L2 learners use L1, L2, and both L1 and L2 in their written peer feedback. The findings show that most Japanese L2 learners make flexible language choices as a result of interaction between the inter and intrapersonal factors inherent in most collaborative learning tasks in L2. Corroborating the findings of the previous studies proving the same issue, most corrective feedback was made using L2 or symbols, and approximately 88% of the corrective feedback points focused on form, lending support to the claim that L2 learners have a marked tendency to attend to surface features during peer review. Language choice for feedback commentaries was found to be influenced by much Although the findings of this study provide further insight into L2 learners' language choices in written peer feedback and the factors underlying such decisions, their tentative nature should be acknowledged. Since research into this topic has been conducted on only participants from Asian collective culture, it is unclear whether what is deemed a social-cultural factor, that is, the use of L1 to hatch negative feedback, to sidestep an issue at hand, or to avoid errors in their L2 comments on stronger peers' work, stems from the participants' societal values and culturally contingent communication styles. Face considerations and tendency to beat around the bush could equally be attributed to learner anxiety about giving incorrect feedback, which has been routinely cited as an issue in studies examining the nature of L2 oral interactions. Either way, what seems clear is that L2 writing teachers need to demonstrate how to use appropriate language to make clear, specific, supportive, and critical comments. It is suggested that more studies conducted on diverse cultural groups of L2 learners so that justifiable recommendations can be put forward about how to better implement peer review in L2 writing classes in a way that leads to effective revision and eventually to maximizing L2 learning opportunities. Thank you for listening.